Feels very official. Okay. Yeah, in that case, I'll get started. So hi, everybody. My name is Zoe. I was a 2014-15 ETA to South Korea. Now I'm an alumni, obviously. I'm the founder of Fulbridge.org, which is part of what's helping bring this workshop to you, along with all the incredible panelists, and most of all, Kate, who's done all this amazing work to make this possible. Just briefly, some background on what Fulbridge is. We're a website that I founded with a group of other then current grantees in 2015. And our mission is to connect Fulbrighters worldwide, and through doing that, to kind of help each other expand our knowledge and educate each other. And so I can't really think of a better expression of this exact mission than this particular workshop. We have joined with the new Fulbrighter platform, which some of you probably have been spending some time on, the Fulbrighter Network, in order to continue this mission. And we wanted to use that opportunity to kickstart these kind of educational and knowledge building activities like this. And if you are interested in getting more involved with Fulbridge, there'll be some information that you'll receive via email in a survey after the workshop. But without further ado, I'll turn this over to our panelists.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of say a little bit of an introduction about where this idea came from. So my background is in dance anthropology, and I did my Fulbright in 2018 in Recife, Brazil. One of our other panelists, Janet, was also there at the same time, and we met there. But this idea really came from, first of all, the idea of, how can we talk to other Fulbrighters about ethnographic methodologies that are used, so the ways that we study culture. But then also, in talking to other Fulbrighters from other disciplines, I realized that, Fulbright is, by definition, by its nature, a cultural experience. And the mission of Fulbright, right, is to become cultural ambassadors. And so when talking to people about their research from other disciplines, I started to hear all these really interesting stories about these cultural experiences, but I started to wonder, okay, how did this cultural experience feed into the research, whether the research was specifically about culture or not? So if somebody was going into the archives, looking into literature in another country, and it really didn't have anything specifically to do with that culture, it was, or like medicine or biology or the sciences where it's not specifically culture related, what did those experiences kind of inform you as a researcher about what you were dealing with? And also, how did it broaden your perspective in terms of what your field is, globally, worldwide? So that's really where this idea came from. And then I started to be interested, okay, so how can these ethnographic methodologies be used in other fields? How can we learn about cultural sensitivity and, reflexivity on our own position as a researcher, as an outsider, speaking in many cases a different language. So that's really what this workshop is about. This would be a series of workshops. So this is kind of our kickoff panel. I wanted to bring together some people from various disciplines to kind of just talk about their experiences and see what you all as participants are interested in talking about. And then the later workshops would be more specifically about ethnographic methodologies, depending on what you all are interested in. And I'm going to send around a survey afterwards just to hear from you all what thoughts you have and what thoughts came up during this discussion. So, we really want to talk about how cultural experiences and encounters shape our Fulbright research, even when that research is not specifically about culture. How do we develop meaningful collaborations in productive and sensitive ways? And then what are just some common concerns that we all have as Fulbrighters when we're working in another country? All of the panelists today are Americans going out into other countries, but I'm also really interested in hearing from people who are not from the United States coming to the United States and what that experience is like as well. So that's the background. I'm going to share my screen really quick because I want to show you all a little graphic that I made that shows where you all are from based on what you filled out on the research or on the registration. So you all are from all over the place, from all kinds of disciplines, and that's really, really exciting. Like, I was really excited to see some fields that I'd never even heard of. I was like, I don't know what that means. And then, quite a few who are in anthropology, ethnography, sociology, kind of more social sciences where we're looking more specifically at culture and society. So So yeah, I think now we're just gonna go through each of the panelists if we're ready to start. Are there any questions before we move on? You can raise your hand either on using the raise your hand function, which is if you go to participants at the bottom, it'll open up a window on the right-hand side and there's a little button that says raise your hand, or if we can see you, if you raise your hand. I see Gordon raising his hand, but I can't hear you, so you'll have to unmute. You're unmuted now.
How to unmute this? Oh, I think I'm unmuted now. No?
We can hear you.
Okay. I would like to, just before we start, every time somebody says ethnographic methodology or something similar, could you please add the word work? I work with indigenous people around the world in the performing arts. Been doing it 25 years. I wouldn't consider it academic in any way. It's what I do for a living. So please broaden the scope beyond academia if you can. I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. That's great. Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions before we move on? And specifically, when we are talking about ethnographic work, these later workshops would be specifically about observation, participant observation, interviewing, especially when we're in a different culture with a different language. What are just some things that we can talk about in terms of that? And then also how we publish, how we communicate our findings after we get back, or communicate them in any other way, whether it's publications in academia or any other outlet.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's move on to the first panelist. So Rachita, who was a Fulbright-Nehru Scholar in India in 2015 to 2016, is now a postdoctoral research fellow at Northwestern in medicine.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, I was in India in 2015 to 16, and I'll just share my screen. And so when I went on my Fulbright, I was in medical school and also pursuing an MPH. And I went to Bihar, which is that red highlighted state on the map. So it's a state in the northeast of India, one of the most populous, the population of over 100 million, one of the poorest in the country. It's made up of 38 districts, and I went with the kind of intention at that time as a student of medicine and public health, with research collaborations related to the kind of broad field of global surgery, with the intent of learning professionally and personally and kind of developing a research project that would make sense for me at my level of training and would kind of work with all the collaborators that I had found before. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of how culture really, and the context and the interactions early on really actually defined what my research focus was, and how what I learned has kind of broadened my perspective in a way that's very different from what is, I think, the norm or kind of the discourse in medicine. So I just share these two photos to kind of give you a sense of what many of the district hospitals in the state of Bihar look like, in terms of facilities and kind of level of facilities. The photo on the left is an X-ray machine with some radiographs hanging. And then the photo on the right is what a lot of the operating rooms in the district hospitals look like in terms of just kind of the open windows, the posters inside the ORs. You can see the sterilization bins in the back, and then kind of how the tables are arranged. Very different from what you would see in any OR, I think, in the US, no matter what kind of like level of facility you were at. So for me, I spent the first 3 months really just, for lack of a better word, wandering around and working with local partners in the NGO. I was partnered with CARE India, which is, CARE is obviously an international NGO, but their branch in India had a partnership with the entire state of Bihar, where they were working closely with the government to help build infrastructure in all of the public district level facilities. So they had really excellent access to every district in the state and had been in the state for 5 years at that point. So it kind of established themselves as a reliable and credible local collaborator. And then on the US side, I was working with the Program in Global Surgery and Social Change, which is a group of mostly physicians and public health professionals who are building this field that's pretty new in academia of global surgery and really trying to understand what that means. The premise being that traditionally in public health, a lot of what has been done has been focused on infectious disease, but if you try to focus on surgery and all of the different components that go into having a successful operation and recovery for a patient, you're really strengthening the health system as a whole. So I think I was very fortunate in that where I was going and who was supporting me in the US, it was very broad. And so I was able to take what I learned during those first 3 months and really let those conversations and those interactions inform what I ended up doing in my research, which I don't think everyone maybe goes in that broadly or has that luxury based on kind of where you are and what your goals are for your grant. But I think that that was an incredible experience in terms of the amount of kind of openness and curiosity and humility that I was able to approach the situation with. And I think that what happened is that blood came out as kind of a focus area that both the PGSSC in Boston on an international level was kind of focusing on and doing projects on as an international issue. And then also came out as something that CARE, just in Bihar, had done a lot of work on because it was so locally and contextually relevant to all of the providers they were working with being able to perform surgery in these district hospitals. And that was not at all on my radar before starting this 9-month grant or when writing the proposal or even kind of building collaboration. And I think it was pretty cool that it worked out that way. And I think that that was necessary for then the success in terms of building collaboration and actually getting research projects done and published. So what we ended up doing was interviewing obstetricians across all of these district hospitals and talking to them about blood and if they had access to it, scenarios where they did or didn't, how that kind of interacted with and affected patient care. And it ended up being a pretty interesting in-depth qualitative study that I think wouldn't have had the buy-in from everyone if I had gone in with a much more focused idea of what I wanted to do. And then second, I think after that experience of those 3 or 4 months, really talking to people, just getting out into the district hospitals with some of CARE's employees and really just listening and learning, I had an interesting experience later in my grant in about March where a collaborator from a local NGO came and visited Bihar. And so their NGO provides basic level supplies for operating rooms around the world. They provide pulse oximeters, which let you measure the patient's oxygen level during surgery. And that's something that they view as kind of a basic thing that operating rooms around the world should have to provide safe surgery. And so one of their staff members was coming over to Bihar and kind of scoping out if they could build a partnership with CARE in the state. And so I kind of ended up being their person who set them up and took them around and showed them what the setup looked like. And it was a fascinating experience because these pictures are showing some of the tubal ligation camps, which are this form of family planning that happens in different states in India, more in Bihar than other states because the fertility rate is much higher in Bihar as a state, where periodically the government will kind of pool together physicians and nurses and resources to do high volume tubal ligation or female sterilization surgeries as a form of birth control, contraception, and also originally when it was kind of developed in the 70s, it was envisioned to help economically. And so I took this collaborator from the US NGO around to one of these camps, and she was, for lack of a better word, kind of shocked by what the infrastructure was like, what the settings were like, what the way care was delivered. And it was I think a really interesting experience for me to see how much those few months of just kind of absorbing and listening had changed my perspective and ability to understand even just a little bit the context that I was in, and then also to see how radically different my understanding was from people who are in the discipline of public health and medicine at a pretty high level in the US and kind of operating at a pretty high level. And then as I've come back to the US and kind of continued forward in the medical training and residency and building different research collaborations here, it's been interesting to see that there's a lot of bias and kind of just lack of knowledge of how important context can be for both research and public health care delivery, and a lot of these NGOs or projects that get set up to try to tackle deficits. And I think that has been kind of a really interesting, unexpected experience from this whole grant. That was all I had prepared. I don't know if anyone has specific questions.
Great. Yeah, I think if there are any specific questions right now, we can take like a couple and then we'll open it up more broadly after. If I think instead of raising your hand, if you want to just unmute if you have something to say, because I'm trying to see everybody. Okay. Yes, Patamini.
Yeah. Hi, Rachita. This was a very interesting experience that you shared, and because I come from India, kind of it is very familiar to me. I'm just wondering, looking at the conditions of the OTs and the other things that you showed, and this is in the district hospitals. Did you have a chance to visit private hospitals? Would you think the situation there was different? Did you kind of learn anything from your surgeon peer? I mean, in the peers in the medical field, did you have a sense of this being the norm, or did you feel that this was kind of a particularly something to find in Bihar and not across India? I realize that the standards, it must have shocked you coming from the US, the kind of norms that you talked about, with which any medical facility would have here. So I was just wondering how it for you, did you come away with the impression that this is something across the country, or it was just Bihar and just district hospitals?
Yeah, I think I definitely had the understanding before and kind of coming away that what I was seeing is very unique to Bihar and to public facilities and district hospitals. And even kind of in my experiences in just Bihar, there was a range with district hospitals where some seemed to be functioning well at the level that you would expect a district hospital to work, and then some didn't. And I think that was also a very important experience because I think a lot of the discourse in medicine tends to try to lump things together, but I definitely had the sense that this was very unique to certain facilities, more so in Bihar than other states. I didn't get the chance to visit public facilities in other states. I only kind of read about them through what's online and what's available. And I could kind of see some similarities and some differences. And then I had the chance to spend some time in the medical college hospital in Bihar, which was also a great experience in terms of seeing the range of public facility from academic to district to primary health center. I didn't spend any time in private facilities. I didn't have those connections.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Do you feel that the healthcare provided kind of was below a certain kind of standard? Did your ethnographic experience being in there, did it show that, with the kind of limited facilities that we just saw, did you feel that the healthcare provided was not really up to the mark in some ways?
I think there were certain ways that felt and did seem shocking in terms of what I was specifically focusing on with blood and speaking with providers who were working at hospitals where there really wasn't an affiliated blood bank, or they really had no way to get blood. And so in obstetrics, you can get a lot of bleeding and it can be an emergency. And many providers were very forthright in our interviews in saying that, when we have a bleeding patient at this facility, we really just refer them because we can't get blood and we know they may not make it but that's really all we can do. And I think that level of resource constriction affecting patient care to such a kind of life and death level was shocking. But I've also kind of, having worked now in Chicago at the county hospital, seen that a lot of it is optics, and that similar kind of resource constraints you can kind of see in resource limited settings in this country as well, but it may look a little bit nicer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rachita. Let's move on to Janet Robbins. She's professor emerita at West Virginia University and was a Fulbright specialist in Brazil when I was there too. And her specialty is world music pedagogy.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thanks for the invitation. I'm going to switch in a minute to some slides to help me recall the more than 10 years of exchange and collaboration with the university in Pernambuco, the Federal University of Pernambuco in Recife. There were two topics for my 10 minutes, and I realized that they kind of blur together, because the first one was to talk about my work in world music pedagogy, specifically the way music culture and education intersect. The second has to do with experience building long-term collaborations. And it was, I think, as I thought about talking today, the building of the long-term collaboration was the absolute path to the project that I conducted. And I think I'm the only one, Kate, correct me if I'm mistaken, who is a Fulbright alumnus as a Fulbright Specialist, not a Fulbright Scholar. So people may want to, if you don't know the difference, you may want to think about that and look that up. So I had more than 10 years of exchange with this university and 5 weeks in a project. So this was like a little sort of bleep on a much larger picture. So I'm going to open my PowerPoint here for a minute, because there's so many wonderful images I wanted to share, and of course this will help me stay on track, I hope. It's almost ready for you to view. Okay, now, oops. Let me see if I can share my screen now. Kate, tell me if I've got it open.
Yep.
Okay.
I see it.
Good. So I just have to wiggle all these little things around here. Okay, I want to do, okay, here we go. So my project took place in 2018. Actually, 2 years ago today, I came home after 5 weeks on March 31st in 2018. So this intersection, as you can see here in the title, of music education, culture, and creative practices, took place at the university in Pernambuco in Recife. And this little, it's kind of cut off there by this picture, but Recife is a city right on the coast of the northeast of Brazil, in the state of Pernambuco. And it's the capital of the state. And I'll never forget the first time I visited, they wanted to be sure that I knew that, you just could cross the ocean and get to West Africa real quickly, which is where all the slaves, came from for years. So that's a very, a state that's full of Afro-Brazilian musical traditions and culture. And that has, really become part of the lifeblood, I think, of what happens in the culture and in the creative practices. Let's see. So for me, the passage and the pathways to the Fulbright Specialist project were numerous. So I want to take some time to talk about this and make sure that I'm keeping track of time too. So I think that building an international partnership is really important, and probably for many people who first visit a country, or they're hoping that they can sustain that partnership, that they can visit a second time. And for me, that was definitely the case. So this really began for me in 2006 when I visited Recife. I was fortunate enough to visit the first time because of a colleague I had met in the U.S. And he subsequently became a really important friend, colleague, and in this case, cultural informant, who sort of paved the way for me for all these years. The work was sustained between UFB, the university there, and my university, West Virginia University. There were two other universities too that were part of a federal project I'll talk about in a minute. So, and I think that the collaboration was strategic in that we worked together quite a bit to plan workshops, presentations at panels and conferences, and to travel back and forth. So mobility was really helped a lot because we had a federal grant. So faculty and students were going back and forth for 4 years. And I should have taken that word research out, I'm sorry, but at the time, I would say I really wasn't conducting research, but I was tapping into research tools that I had learned over the years. So this is Flavio and my friend who I taught with at Eastman for many summers. And as I mentioned, it was he who gave me the access to communities and classrooms. He was really the guide to the safe spaces and practices. I felt really protected a lot of the time. He became kind of my narrator for learning about the background and the meaning that music had for people. He was definitely a wonderful tour guide. We had many expeditions and explorations. So it sort of sounds like a vacation, and I think at the beginning of my time there it was. But over time, it became much more than that. So in this sabbatical, 2006, which is 14 years ago, I really did immerse myself in 7 weeks of trying to soak in as much as I could about music and culture, and visits to the old city and to the sister city of Olinda took place on a regular basis. But I spent a lot of time in the university as well. Here you see some of the community drumming groups, and I learned about the cultural musical rhythm or tradition of maracatu. And here you can see maracatu at Carnival. So I got my first taste of that and have been learning about it ever since. So this has been an ongoing quest for me to understand and learn this music and this movement and this tradition and the meaning behind it. Serendipity just was that there was a group of children at the first rehearsal that I went to who were performing, and their teacher, who you can see on the right, was eager to show me how to do Frevo, which I think Kate will talk about a little bit. But so I just jumped in, and I'm glad I did, because the children were so eager to share what they knew about, maracatu and Frevo specifically. So I was invited to visit their school, their after-school program, which was a great opportunity that I don't think would have happened if I hadn't been in the right place at the right time. And that was sort of the beginning of me dipping my toe into learning about one musical tradition. I thought, well, if I could just learn one really well, that would allow me to bring ideas back to my students in the United States, where I was teaching music education methods courses to undergraduates and graduate students, and doing a lot of work with teachers in professional development workshops in the U.S. But after that first sabbatical, our university's proposal to develop a international exchange program was accepted, and we were funded by FIPSE in the U.S., Federal Improvement Program for Secondary Education, and in Brazil, the CAPES program. So this is a collaborative international consortium between U.S. and Brazil that lasted 4 years officially, and it gave us lots of time to, as I said, travel back and forth, connect with faculty, learn about curriculum. One of the things that was really important for music students was to support language immersion, And actually for our music students, they weren't used to traveling overseas or over to another place around the world. They're kind of used to their own little private lessons in their own private studios. So we were really trying to expand their global perspective, and in an effort to sort of transform music teacher education overall. So the Music Alive was the name of that project. I'm just going to quickly give you a glimpse of the fact that we did have a lot of student and faculty exchange. Faculty gave workshops. You can see me there in the bottom quadrant there, the picture. Mostly they were music education related and jazz education related content. Sergio Alvarez on the right taught in HEO at the university there, and he came and gave master classes at WVU. He subsequently spent a semester here as a postdoc. So we found all sorts of, like I said, strategic ways to be with each other and to continue to learn from each other and with each other. I then returned to Recife at the end of the Music Alive time to have another 5 weeks. And by that time, I was able to work with former Music Alive students who had come to West Virginia University to study, who were now teachers in schools. I was very familiar with the music education methods classes that Flavie was teaching, but I had a lot more work to do in the community to learn really about how culture and music education were intersecting with each other. So this was the trip that I really got to visit the Maracatu Nação, it's called, where the mestres teach, or the masters teach. I was told that if I really wanted to learn about Maracatu, I'd better look for the masters. So again, Juliana at the top here was a former student of mine. She was there in 2011. She was there with me during my Fulbright project too, even though she's now finishing up a doctorate in University of Washington in Seattle. So the students became cultural informants as well. And here's just a little clip of what I was getting to see in that visit. Hopefully this will play. I won't play a whole thing, but. So you can see that he was working with young kids, and there's some older people in the background. So it was kind of a intergenerational school that was part of a neighborhood, and they prepared all year for the carnival parades and competitions. And so Maracatu was really part of their cultural, if I can get back now. Oh, this is where I knew I'd get in trouble. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can get back to my, here we go. No, maybe. Kate, I'm having trouble here.
We're seeing the normal view, so if you're able to share again.
Okay. Says, oh, sorry. This is where I need Juliana, my grad student, who always makes things work for me.
I think it's showing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was really interesting for me to actually see what I felt like was the place where this tradition had lived and kind of was born and lived and continued to grow in the community. This was never part of the university curriculum, I think, for a long time. And we've had that kind of tension between formal and informal education and learning going on for quite a while. And world music pedagogy is bringing these two worlds together. And I hope to make some sense of that in a minute. But then to the university classroom, what I found interesting was that that the students were asked to go into the communities or go into their family heritages and bring back some of the rhythms and sonic flavors into their music classrooms. So they were working on, for example, a maracatu composition and performing these together. So I got to see that kind of in action, and all of that really led to my curiosity about how music education, culture, and creative practices could sort of grow even more in the school there. So the Fulbright project really came about, as I mentioned already, because of this collaborative venture over time. And I think what I discovered was that we had these intersecting values of the importance of music learning and music making being surrounded by context and by valuing transmission models, which were not that common in music education practices and even in performance practices in many institutions of higher education. So there was a lot of, the project was anchored really in the previous work I'd done and aligned to the institutional needs that were specifically to develop fusings between music education and ethnomusicology. So the one new piece at this time was that they had just started a graduate program in ethnomusicology. And so there was a great interest in seeing how these two could come together and to develop projects that could connect education to the local heritages of students and basically stimulate greater curiosity about and capacity for teaching music from a global or local, what they call global perspective. And this is actually the very fusing, world music pedagogy that is the very fusing of music education and ethnomusicology. So it was a perfect time and a perfect opportunity for me to jump in. So there were two things that took place. There was a 3-day symposium, the first festival in North Schulwerk, which was, I think, very important because it really brought alums back to campus. It provided a really high quality professional development opportunity for teachers in the area and undergraduate students, which is not something that's common in Northeast Brazil or at all. They really lack that kind of professional development experience. This had to be free for students and for teachers because they wouldn't have been able to afford to come otherwise. And so it really was kind of groundbreaking in that respect. And very exciting for me to work with Juliana, my former student, Flavio, my colleague, Poliana, who was a movement teacher. And they had 50 students come, which was very exciting. And it happened over 3 days. There were workshops, roundtables, and I think that's the main thing I wanted to say. And performances, of course. So am I way over my time, Kate? Because I
think if you take like 2 or 3 more minutes, we'll be good.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So the second piece of the work that I did was they invited me to do some presentations in a graduate seminar in music education. And this was a small group of students because, as I mentioned, this was a new program. So this is when I offered sessions on world music pedagogy. This is an actual sort of concept now in music education that was started by Pat Campbell at the University of Washington. And it's a kind of a listening as a means and methods for engaging with and learning music. What I found interesting was, I was so excited to learn about the music and musical culture of Brazil. They weren't too interested in learning about, it didn't seem to me, musical cultures outside of their own. Maybe it's because they were still trying to figure out their own musical culture. So all of the graduate students who did projects actually researched their own musical traditions. And of course, there are many, and they're very diverse. So they did dig into something they didn't know. But basically, the goal, I think, was summed up in an email that I got from Flavio, and he's still working on this today, even today. But he keeps working with cultural material and rhythms because he believes that this is the way to bring students. I guess to approach students. I'm going to read because he says it better than me paraphrasing. I want them to bring all the memories and materials that they have already absorbed in their daily life. And he believes that that's the best way to begin with students in his methods program, it's called, is by using their music DNA that's full of maracatus and caboclinhos and coco and all these wonderful rhythms that seem to be kind of buried in the community and sort of underneath the covers of family heritage and tradition. And he's bringing them forward and asking students to think about teaching them, which is really what world music pedagogy is doing around the world. So it's beginning to take off in Pernambuco. They also formalized some of the compositions and gave a wonderful concert. I'll just give you 2 seconds of it. You see the combining traditional instruments and classical instruments. And this is the Monica Tube composed by Jamaica right here. So because there's lack of time, I'll move on, but it gives them such pride to think that their work and their music is, sort of being appreciated and being honored in that way. The other sort of theme of the presentation or workshop today was to think about the cultural encounters. And I guess the one that came to mind for me the most was just the ambiguity that exists when you're in another place. And so I identified several that I had to embrace over the time. And I think that embracing communication is so important. Communication really matters. And whether for me, if I'm teaching music, if I'm teaching movement, communication of language is a lot easier. I can use gesture, I can model, I can show them. But it is important to learn the language. Timing is everything. There are a lot of jokes that people make about Latin American time and how it just seems to be very different from our time. But sometimes it's for very good reasons, because in the case of the students at the universities, they often had to spend hours getting to campus, riding 3-4 buses. So being late is not always understood. And but it is important to try to be on time and to honor that. But it was interesting for me to get used to that. I really had to adjust my expectations, and that was hard for me because I didn't know what was going to happen. And I think it was the ambiguity that was making me uncomfortable. Educational resources that are limited or lacking can really result in a change of plan. So what you get used to doing and how you get used to teaching in your own classroom in the US is not going to necessarily be the same. And you just have to adjust. And the other thing that's kind of a good surprise was that music just happens. I mean, it just explodes in hallways, and you just have to be ready for it. It's not the same kind of neat and tidy little music that happens in a box. So the lessons that I learned were, and I think I learned a lot from our students who went back and forth, who kept journals, was that learning happens when you move beyond surface encounters. You really have to spend time in a place, in a culture, in a country, to have that exposure to the life world of the culture that can ground and unify you. And it's, as we all know, these are probably things that you can just shake your head at, but stepping outside unfamiliar territory can really be important in leading to curiosity and more tolerance and empathy, really. And as I said, music is more than academic. And that's one of the things that I valued so much about my first visits, about my last visit. And this is something that's kind of at the core of world music pedagogy. Most important was that creativity lives in unexpected places. So it's the unexpected experience and the sort of spontaneity that I found just fascinating about the musical culture and the culture that I was trying to learn more about when I was in Recife all those times, 8 times actually. So I'm sorry I took so long.
Thanks, Janet. No, that's great. And for the sake of time, and also because I'm also talking about Recife, I'm just going to segue right into my part. And then we'll probably just go through everybody and take questions at the end. But if you have questions throughout, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll go through them. But let me share my screen. So I was also in Recife at the same time as Janet on her most recent trip in 2018. And I focused my research as a dance anthropologist on Frevo, which Janet also mentioned, which is a really high energy, fun, colorful dance that has origins in the Brazilian martial art of capoeira, which is a martial art that I had been training for 10 years before I went to Recife. And what I want to talk about right now, I think Janet has already given kind of a really good background on what music in Recife is like. As a dance anthropologist, I really focus on the body and like the embodied experience in a new place. And so all of my research is really attentive to not only like when I go to a dance class, but also like walking down the street to the grocery store, or, you know, just kind of like all of those feelings that you have in your body as you are walking through a new space. And for me, also the linguistic challenges that I experienced as I was learning Portuguese and figuring things out and making connections and being confused and all of that sort of thing. So I focused my research on Frevo because of my background in capoeira. And as you can see in the photos and some of the videos that I'm sharing, it's a really high energy, colorful, like fun kind of dance, whereas capoeira it's a martial arts that's often described as a dance that has roots in slave resistance in Brazil. So in some ways, it's seen as kind of like, oh, it's just a dance, they're not really fighting, but it actually comes from a very aggressive place. And my experience with capoeira was also that it was quite aggressive. And so I was wondering, how does such a fun, ebullient, kind of colorful dance, it just seems like it's all fun and play, how does that connect to capoeira? And my research interests are in what I call dances of resistance. So for me, capoeira is a perfect example of this because it's about the embodied resistance of slaves in Brazil and that legacy that is continued over the past, 100 years since, well, more than 100 years since there was slave resistance in Brazil, but since capoeira was kind of a official martial art. And so then how would Frevo then also fit into this category of dances of resistance? What are some of the strategies that are shared between these two forms, even though they look so different on the surface? So that's what my research is about. What I really want to talk about is Recife itself. When I told people, especially my Brazilian friends, that I was going to Recife, they were all shocked and they said, why would you want to go to Recife? It's so dangerous there. And Recife does have a reputation for having very high crime. So to be honest, I was very scared to go. No, like my previous research projects had been in very safe areas. And so I was nervous about going, and I had to take a lot of precautions when I went. I had to make sure I was living in a safe area. I made sure I took Ubers everywhere. I didn't take my cell phone out when I was walking around at night. I didn't go out alone. And this especially came into play during Carnival, when things get pretty dicey, especially after dark. And so my research was based in Carnival. That was what I was supposed to be doing. I was supposed to basically party, right, for my research, but also a lot of those events, people, especially local Recife residents, were telling me, Kate, you really might not want to go to this one because it's after midnight, and there's often a lot of aggression and violence and crime that happens, so maybe sit this one out. And so in a lot of cases, I took that advice and I just stayed home and watched things on TV, or kind of got what I could out of the news or Facebook or whatever. And it wasn't until about halfway through my Fulbright that I was talking to some friends that I had made at a capoeira class, and one of them said, it really was probably a good idea that you avoided those events. As a white American woman who doesn't know the culture, who doesn't know the language very well, probably was a good idea, but she really emphasized the importance that I do not whitewash Carnival, and or that anyone whitewash Carnival and kind of say, oh, well, Carnival shouldn't have this kind of energy about it. And so it's difficult because, of course, no one wants the events to be unsafe, but also we can't forget the history from which Carnival and these dance forms come from, which is a history of resistance, right, and fighting against oppression. And so when we take that out or we try to ignore it, that is lost. And so for me, the question became, if Frevo is going to be effective as a dance of resistance, or as a dance that gives expression to people who experience oppression and social marginalization, how do we recognize Carnival as a time for people to express themselves? And with this, of course, as the researcher, I had to think about how can I shift my own perspective and kind of reflect on my own discomforts, right? And my own feelings of insecurity, and how do I confront that, right? So it was a really tough balance for me to strike. I felt like I made some really good friends in the community, and my experience actually differed quite a bit from Janet's, because even though I was based at the university, I actually, for one reason or another, I ended up not really having very strong connections with the university, and instead I had very strong connections within the dance community, people that lived in really kind of some of the rougher parts of the city. But I felt like they really looked out for me, so I felt like I got really lucky in that respect. And also kind of, there was a little bit of suspicion about people from the university, and so I felt like I got a little bit of cred. But what I came to realize, of course, was that this atmosphere of kind of resistance, right, this energy is really what creates not just a culture of Frevo, but this whole constellation of popular music and dance forms that Janet talked a little bit about. There's so many there. The northeast of Brazil is known for being very rich in these different traditions. And so kind of trying to understand how these things fit together. And it's complicated and ambiguous and contradictory at times. So one of the biggest challenges for me has been how to express this after getting back, how to communicate these experiences to people after I've gotten back from my Fulbright. Because I certainly don't want to be negative. I don't want to cast Recife or Brazil in a bad light. And when I talk to my own family, I'm honest with, we just let it out. When I talk to Brazilians, often there's a certain understanding. They know the context. They know that I'm not just trash talking the place, but that I'm hopefully seeing the many different aspects of the experience. But I try to be responsible and make sure to explain how such an amazingly rich culture is shaped by economic and racial struggle. So for me, as a white American woman coming in with all this Fulbright money, how do I stand back and acknowledge my own privilege, right? That's a really, really important part of what I've had to do. And in writing and publishing about this work, I've had to come to terms with, okay, how do I present this is a culture of violence and aggression, but also how that has actually created something really wonderful and beautiful, right? And that these strategies that dancers use are like, they're training for the unpredictability of Carnival. You never know what's going to happen at Carnival, but at the same time, they're developing strategies, they're training strategies in their bodies to deal with that in everyday life. So what I mean is, like, training in Frevo is like developing street smarts to survive. And so what I'm doing now is I'm kind of trying to step back. I'm writing a new chapter that's for a public health and social inclusion handbook, which is a totally new thing for me. I don't know anything about these disciplines, but trying to step back and learn a little bit about social dynamics and the development of Brazilian class society, and trying to fit this kind of broader perspective of class dynamics in with the very individual anthropological data that I was working with. And I feel like, anthropology is very individual. We're like, who told you that? Who did you interview? Who is the individual? And then these other fields are forcing me to take a step back and think, okay, what's going on here on a larger, in a larger context. And then stepping back even further, trying to acknowledge, Brazil obviously has its own unique set of challenges that are always developing every day, but also learning how these issues occur in other parts of the world, so that if I go on a Fulbright to another country at some point, how do we see similar dynamics and how are things different? So, so that's a little bit about my research. I think maybe we can take questions on the Brazil portion now, really quick, maybe like 3 minutes, and then we'll move on to Amy and Ilana. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and just chime in.
So I have a question. So I have actually two. So one of them, I was really struck by when you were talking about how there's an opportunity cost for us to be hosted in other countries. They're worried about our personal safety. And I'm also a white woman. And I think that when you're in a Black culture, oftentimes you stand out and that you create a personal burden for your hosts because they're trying to make sure that you're safe, but yet have a good experience. And I'm wondering about like managing opportunity costs. And then the second part of that is again, back to white privilege and being a white person. I just kind of struggle oftentimes with how it feels on the other end if they feel like they're being studied, that somehow you're researching them or examining them or making evaluative decisions about like their being in some way, or taking what they've done and somehow using it for your own end to advance your career. And so if you want to comment on any of those two thoughts, that would be really welcome, because it's something I grapple with.
Yeah, I can take the second question. I think, Janet, you can take the first one. I know a little bit about your experience. But in terms of whether my informants think that I am, studying them like specimens or something, I try to be very conscious of that and really develop personal relationships with people. I found that it helps that I'm a dancer and I have my own dance background. So I have trained in Irish dancing my whole life, which is another kind of culturally specific dance form. And so I find that the more I kind of engage with people on that level, like, hey, we're dancing together, we're having a good time, and actually getting up and moving with people is a really excellent way to connect with people. Like there's a lot of respect that comes from getting up and like sucking at something, like just really not being very good when you try it for the first time. And I actually call this in my methodology sweaty struggles, like that I actually get up and I sweat with you, and that seems to mean something to people. And I find that, yes, being vulnerable, exactly, and accepting that feeling of discomfort. So for me, that's how I approach it. And it becomes difficult when you're writing, right? Because you really want to make sure that you're interpreting people's quotes correctly and using them in a way that is responsible.
I'm going to just piggyback on that a minute, just to say that I think for me, I was always eager to learn from them. So putting yourself in the position of learner rather than researcher, I never felt like I was bringing some authority to the table. And part of the way you can do that is just, literally, I was eager to learn. I wanted to know what they felt and knew, and simple things like listening and jumping in to participate. I'll never forget being at a koku party, and it was midnight and I was exhausted and people were still singing and dancing. And instead of going home, my host, kind of teasing me, pushed me back into the crowd and said, go do more research. So, but back to your first question, I'm not sure I understood the cost. I think the cost for specialists and scholars are different. I didn't have I think the stipend is a lot different, but yeah, could you clarify that your first question again? If we have time, we may not, but I think I forget who asked it.
So it was a matter of, and I appreciate both of your responses. It was really helpful, and I do agree that taking a learner stance is a good way to do it. It's more opportunity costs, not so much in them in terms of dollar value, but it's more of the fact that they have to be vigilant about our welfare, that they feel a sense of responsibility for our presence. And that's something where I know if I have Black skin and blended in, it would not be such an issue. It would not be such a hardship on them to have my presence. And so I'm always really kind of aware of that. And on one hand, I'm collaborating and helping to make a contribution. But on the other hand, I know that there's energy that they're putting forth in terms of my well-being. Well,
definitely my host did that a lot for me. And he was incredible. And I'm sure it was exhausting for him to always be looking out for me. And, but at the same time, I think that he gained something from my being there as well, just because he had a collaborator, somebody who was listening to him and caring about the similar things that he cared about. And it's an interesting balance, because I didn't want to stand out, but they just looked at me and laughed whenever I would say that. Like, there's no way you're not going to stand out. Even if you wear a hat, your eyes are green, things like that. So you can't cover up who you are. And I guess you just, but at the same time, I think I have found there and in other places, people are so eager and happy that you want to learn about their music, their life. And, if you can be in that mode, then that works, I think, pretty well.
Yeah, I think this mode of like constantly grappling and being okay with grappling is central, right? Because we're never going to be in a place where we're doing it all right.
Yeah. And not standing on the back, with your pad and paper, taking notes and distancing yourself from what's going on. You really have to be right there in the middle of it all, on the floor, doing whatever they're doing, playing the game, singing the songs, moving, dancing, communicating in some way, hugging,
which is so different now.
Yeah, so I was going to say, we won't be doing, they're not doing that either anymore.
Great. So I want to move on to our next panelist to make sure that we get through everyone. Thank you, Janet.
Yeah.
So Amy Kuritzky just came back from Ecuador. She was on her Fulbright as a student researcher and was a recent graduate of Rice University. She's interested in nutritional anthropology, environmental science, and anthropology.
Hi. So I got back last week. I was in country. I was in the middle, 6 months into my 10-month Fulbright fellowship when I had to come back, which also raises a lot of really interesting questions, like what you were just saying, or the question that we just had about opportunity cost. Because a lot of the reasoning behind bringing people out of country was that it was a burden and a responsibility to have to now be responsible for keeping a bunch of foreigners alive. So it's interesting and also very sad. So I studied anthropology, cultural anthropology, and environmental science, dual degree in undergrad, and my project was looking at different understandings of nutrition, how people decide what it means to eat healthy and where that knowledge comes from. So thinking on different scales, on the local scale, in terms of international involvement, policy, things like that. And I was working with affiliation with a research center that had just started in Ecuador called Coledo's Center for Interdisciplinary Ethnography. That was it was like a joint project between the University of Cuenca in Ecuador and Flaxo, Ecuador. And how I got involved with it was because my undergrad thesis advisor was friends with the people who started it. And so I met them through a personal connection. And they were amazing. And even now that I'm back and like technically my Fulbright grant is over, I'm still working remotely on all of the projects with the center. And so I ended up kind of doing my own research alongside working with the center, working on their projects. One of the projects we were doing was a collaborative project with some nutritionists at the university. And that's my sort of overarching interest, is how to take ethnographic findings or different sorts of data and put them in conversation. And so how to put, for example, quantitative numeric data in conversation with ethnographic data, how to not just put them side by side, but like make a form of data that gives a bigger picture, like a more holistic picture. And so in that sense, I think that in thinking about culture, something really important to me is thinking about culture as broader than just, I don't know what people think of when they think of culture, like customs, traditions, things like that. I think a lot of being in Ecuador, I was thinking of culture, science, for example, as culture, and also just the broader culture of academia. And so my cultural encounters were not just, the specific research activities I was doing, but it was like drinking wine with my professors and hearing them talk about all of the crazy stuff that goes on behind the scenes in the bureaucratic systems in Ecuador and things like that. And I guess what I want to talk most about is ethnography, because it's something I have strong feelings about. And I guess, I don't really know how to word this. In my opinion, ethnography is pretty messed up. I love it. I chose to do it. I had countless conversations with my undergrad advisors of just walking into their office and being like, help, ethnography is effed up, but I love it and I want to do it, so what do I do? And it was basically what you were saying, Kate, of just like, you have to keep grappling with these things. Like, the problems with ethnography are never going to disappear. And so I think the biggest one is just that it is inherently extractive. Like, you're taking information, experiences from other people, and you're benefiting off of that because you're bringing it back into the research environment. You're producing articles. Even just in day-to-day interactions, you're gaining all the social clout from having a broad experience. Yeah, and you can't avoid that because that's how academic research production happens. And so then the question would be what to do about it. And that's something that obviously I'm still thinking through. But some things just from talking with the people that I worked with in Ecuador, one thing that was really important to them was that people not repeat the same tropes about Ecuador that always come through. So like most of the people that come, they come to do research on indigenous populations, and they produce sort of the same ideas about Ecuadorian culture as a whole. And so to think about things that haven't really been studied in Ecuador. So for example, I'm really interested in science and technology studies. So like the study of science, so the study of nutrition science, for example. And that's something which happens a lot in the U.S. There's a lot of really cool research about the production of scientific knowledge. And then in places like Ecuador, it's not considered to be like an interesting enough, like there's too many other things to look at. Like you should be looking at the indigenous cultures of Ecuador, for example, not thinking about what's going on in a laboratory, in a university, in the city. And so something that was really important to my collaborators in Ecuador was just to rethink the questions that we're asking. I think also one thing too is with thinking about, one thing that I would do a lot was I would always compare all of my sort of experiences and things that I heard to the way it was in the US. Like when I would talk to people about nutrition and I'd be like, oh, well, in the US we do X, Y, Z, and so this is an interesting difference. And I think maybe for me personally, that helps me to sort of think through what I was finding out. But that in itself reproduces a power dynamic of having the US be the standard, that you're not even the standard in terms of like quality, but just the standard in terms of like, this is what you're thinking about and everything is relative to the US. And so I think that's something that for me personally, I'm trying to do better about, is not always think of everything immediately in comparison to the US, but in its own context. I really like what you said, Janet, about being in the position of a learner. I think that's a really helpful framework to take. I also think that one thing that I found to be really important too, though, was to, at the same time, not ignore the fact that I am a researcher, because there's always going to be an inherent power dynamic there. And so when I would be in situations where it was like trying to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing, to be clear that I want to learn, but also just to recognize that, recognize the power relations that come with the fact that I'm here on this really, really generous scholarship to study people. Because the fact, like, it's horrible, but it is what you're doing at the end of the day. And like, there's so much work to be done. Like in anthropology, people are saying, you know, you speak with people instead of for people, making this sort of like rhetorical distinction, which I think is a really good one. But I think at the end of the day too, like collaboration, all these ideas a lot of times get like thrown on as buzzwords to sort of circumvent having to think through the power dynamics that still exist. And so that was something, these were a lot of things that I was hearing from my professors in Ecuador who have had countless experience with U.S. scholars interested in working with them in some capacity. And I think just a final note to end on, Gordon, when you mentioned it in the beginning about thinking about the term ethnographic work, I know what you were saying about it being, thinking about it as more than just academic, but it's interesting you bring that up because I also, in general, like to use the term ethnographic work. And for me, it's because it raises the question of what work is your ethnography doing, right? Like it's not just, you're not just describing something, like what you're producing is doing something in the world, good, bad, ugly, all of the above. And so that relates to what you were saying too, Kate, about thinking about how you talk about your experience, how you write about your experience. I've yet to do any of those things, but I don't know, that's kind of just a big question that always sticks with me is like, what is the work of ethnography doing in the world? How can it work with other disciplines? How can it do good? How can it do bad? Things like that. Sorry, that was a little all over the place, but those are the notes I wrote down as everyone else was talking.
That's great. Thank you, Amy. Thanks for your perspectives. I think, yeah, it's really important we're all asking these questions. I want to give, Gordon is messaging me privately with some thoughts, and I thought that maybe if you could just provide a couple of thoughts in response to what you were just saying, really, really briefly. I know we only have 15 minutes, and I want to give Ilana enough time to speak as well.
I can do brief. Very briefly, I'm an anthropologist. I haven't been an academic since 1992. I've had my own business since 1995. I work with indigenous people around the world in the performing arts. I don't publish, or very rarely. My goal is to get people heard. And the simplest way and briefest way to do this is to tell you what I tell Native people all the time. And I've worked on every continent except Antarctica. I tell, I'm not Native. I don't pretend to be one. I don't play one on TV. And that means Native people choose the message. If it's a traditional Navajo dance group, a Navajo fashion designer, an Australian Aboriginal rock band, or a Maori theater company. And I've worked with all of those. And my job is not to tinker with the message and add feathers or to get a publication. My job is to turn up the volume. And I tell them, I'm a white guy. I want it loud. I want everyone to hear what you do, read what you do, eat what you're making, whatever it is. And that's my goal. And that's the simplest way to think of what I do. And now I will mute and we can proceed.
Thank you, Gordon. Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, when I have students ask me that question too, when I teach dance ethnography, it's like, okay, well, how am I amplifying? You know, I'm not trying to take ownership over this culture. You know, maybe I'll try to embody it. I try to do it. I might look like a fool, you know, but really, like, how do we value these things beyond, especially in the arts, right? Like beyond what are considered Western classical arts, right? So for me, I'm really interested in dance and music from specific cultures. And so really amplifying, turning up the volume.
Kate,
Yeah.
I would just quickly say that in world music pedagogy, one of a common practice is to teach alongside someone from the culture so that they're the expert, you're not. You know, I don't know if that may be too simplified, too black and white, but it's so important to have them by your side when you can do that. And you can do a lot on video now, and they're wonderful recordings, and bring those people into the classroom so that you're raising their voices rather than, you know, speaking for them. So turn up the volume. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. It sounds simple, but like, that's exactly what you need to do. And now everyone's using Zoom, so.
Yeah. And get out of the way sometimes, you know, move over.
Right. Exactly. Great, thanks. Okay, let's move on to Ilana. Ilana Harold is still still in South Korea right now.
Yes.
As a Fulbright English teaching assistant. She's a recent graduate of the University of Maryland, which is also where I did my work. And her interests are in environmental science and technology.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Alana Harold, and I did recently graduate from the University of Maryland. My degree is in environmental science and technology, and I minored in geographic information systems. But I'm not doing research, nor am I affiliated with a university here in South Korea. I am an English teaching assistant. But of course, also part of the Fulbright mission is to be a cultural ambassador for the United States, and also to become immersed, in the culture that you're living in and learn as much about that as possible. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about my experience in a homestay, which has really vastly impacted the way that I've been able to learn about my host country, South Korea. And I guess a little bit also about my interest outside of teaching, because for me, this is, I don't plan to be, an English teacher forever or teaching ESL forever, but it has allowed me to see a new culture and see the other things that I'm interested in a really new way. So it's been great. And kind of as Amy said, these past, I guess it's been a while now, especially in South Korea, that we've been dealing with the coronavirus situation. So things have been a little bit rocky, and actually, as of April 12th, I will no longer be affiliated with the Fulbright program, other than as my alumni status, but I'll be working just with my school privately. And for the foreseeable future, classes will be online, so that'll be also an interesting transition. But yeah, so one of the things that's pretty unique to Fulbright Korea for the ETA program is living in a homestay. And for me, my biggest interest in learning about a new culture, I think, is really personal relationships, like building those relationships with people. And my homestay family has truly become like family to me. And they, I would say, are one of my biggest outlets in learning about Korean culture and being able to understand certain perspectives, things that I might see on the news or things that you might hear, experiences that you might have in classrooms, things like that. And so I have, I guess, two stories to share about how, bridging my environmental science research interests with my interest in cultural learning, and then also being an English teacher here in South Korea. So ultimately, I do hope to probably go back to graduate school, and my main interest lies in bringing science education to people, and how do different cultures impact the way we view, I guess, sustainability, and sort of balancing maybe responsibility for our earth with cultural perspectives, and also challenges in terms of society that might hinder, I guess, sustainable practices and things like that. So I hope to ultimately go back in that direction. But one thing that from my host family, so when I started, I told them about myself, but language has been it's a big barrier, I guess. That brings me to my other point. I'll just real quick, I think in working with other people, language has been huge. So my job, which is, I guess, a little bit different, is to bring, American culture and the English language to people. So instead of necessarily, it's a reciprocal relationship of learning, but my job is to be teaching English at the end of the day. But something that's helped me connect most is, I've been studying Korean a lot since I've been here, and that, I think, has been the biggest factor in being able to communicate and being able to learn about a new culture. So I think language has just and I haven't studied a language very deeply before, but thinking about language, I think going forward will be a really important perspective in terms of understanding other cultures, and also being able to understand people on a deeper level. So I was able to explain my background to my host family, and they were very receptive to that, about like learning about the earth and the environment. And actually when I first came, they drank all their water in like big plastic water bottles, and I would just, it hurt me on the inside a little bit, but I would usually just try to always fill up my water bottle, at the gym, at school, like not use it as much. And something that they noticed was like I would always bring reusable silverware and stuff like that. And they started also pointing out habits to me that they have about like always when we go out, they always bring containers, and there's not a lot of like the same carry out containers that we have here. So we started talking about these things like this, like plastic waste particularly. And one day my host mom just came up to me and was like, this is in Korean, but we're getting a water filter, like a filler to just fill up your water bottle, and we're not going to use any more plastic anymore. And she was so proud and so happy. And that was just like a huge moment for me of being like, even though I kind of went away from my discipline and my passion of environmental science for a bit, is that like if you are just going about your life and sharing things with people in a respectful way, and also interested in learning about them, learning their language, learning their culture, that you could possibly make a difference and learn a lot of things from each other. And then another one was my little host sister. There was like some trash around the apartment, and she was telling me how she feels that like young people, we're going to live in the world for about a lot longer. These are her, and we need to be taking care of the earth because we're the ones who like things are going to affect. And she's in 4th grade, so, and that like she always gets mad at her friends if they litter or things like that. And we just help pick up the trash together and like take it to the facility. So that was also a really big moment for me, just knowing that like, because I had made these personal connections, that you can, that people can learn from you, and also just a very reciprocal relationship in terms of that. So yeah, those are two of my, I guess, relating to how do we bring science on like a very small level, or how sustainability really can bridge cultures, even if it's not something that you might necessarily think about on an everyday basis, or that might not be quite as widespread in the news or things like that in a society. So that's pretty, the only thing I have to share on my screen is like, I have a couple pictures, I guess, if anyone wants to see. I don't know how let's see. Oh, wait. Is that not? I don't know if did that not work? Okay.
No, we're not seeing.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, there's my host family and our friends that we hang out with a lot. Yeah. Okay. But that's essentially what I had, because I know as I said, my position is a bit different than that of a researcher who might be thinking about how culture impacts research, because a lot of my daily life is cultural exchange on the ground, I would say, like in my classroom and in my life. But I would say, because I am a teacher of another language, learning the native language has been one of the biggest things. So yeah, just really embracing the cultural differences and trying not to come from a perspective, I think kind of like, as Amy was saying, of like comparing it to the U.S., because I did find myself at first doing that a lot. And be like, oh, well, the U.S. education system is like this, or I would have these certain resources, or, why don't, what value, like struggling a lot with like, how much value does English bring, or students who might not be interested in English. But when I learn their language too and connect with them outside of the classroom and outside of, I guess, which would be like my research, that I was able to form like deeper bonds. And even my goal became less so about teaching English and more so about becoming like an ambassador for the U.S. and having them have like a positive memory of the English teacher that was spent time at their school. So yeah.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I think this is exactly why we wanted to bring an ETA, English Teaching Assistant, into the conversation, because even if you're not doing quote unquote research, you're doing cultural exchange, your cultural ambassadorship, and having these experiences that you're also having a lot of insights and reflection about as well. So are there any, we have a few more minutes, are there any follow-up thoughts to Ilana or to anybody who spoke today? Alicia.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi everyone, I just wanted to clarify my comment in the chat. I was a Fulbright English teaching assistant in Brazil in 2018, so I relate with a lot of what Ilana said. Did I say your name right? So my comment was just like, I was hearing a lot of thoughts on privilege, power, and where our personhood stands in these countries that we go to and are privileged enough to be paid to do research or teach English in these countries. And just kept thinking on, okay, maybe some way to like level that playing field would be to include those people that we worked with in these conversations. I know that there's probably a lot of barriers to entry given our lived experiences already with tech, Wi-Fi. Maybe they don't have Zoom, maybe they don't even have a laptop. So I get all of that. That's probably in the back of our minds, but I was just curious maybe if there was any way that we could include them in the conversation, and that would make me add another flavor and layer to our dialogue, because we're going into these countries and learning from them, but there's an intergenerational, interpersonal exchange happening. So if we include them in that, maybe that'll level it. So that was just my thought with that comment.
Hi, Katie.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. This was a really interesting conversation, and I'm just curious to know, for all of you that have come back, the alumni especially, or the ones that are going to come back, how do you see yourselves carrying on this knowledge that you kind of, gathered, and the ethnographic experience of doing research, or even the work, ethnographic work, to quote Gordon? How do you plan to utilize these understandings in the work that you do back in the US? Because I'm here as a Fulbright scholar, a teaching and research scholar from India. So I could, I have many similar stories of the culture shocks that I had in the education system. And I know that working here now for several months, I know the cultural diversity that we see in our classrooms and in our teaching and research contexts. So what lessons would all of you have for your own context back in the States, with all the rich experience that you had in your cultural ethnography experience? Does it make sense?
Yeah, do we want to take it just one at a time, each one of us, starting with Rachita? Not on the spot.
No, that's okay. I think that's something that I've thought of a lot. And I think for me in medicine, there is, I think the experience and the year and the kind of deep, like you said, knowledge that comes with it has helped me just be more confident in that. I think medicine is not as reflective a field as kind of like this, what we're doing here, in terms of really trying to be self-critical and self-reflective. I think that it's just not emphasized in medical education or in residency training. And so I think for me, the experience brought a lot of confidence in terms of when I am engaging with people who are higher up in what is also a hierarchical field and kind of have more old school, but are very set in their views of what global health looks like in medicine, which is a lot more unidirectional and kind of a lot of emphasis on what we can provide. I think that this experience has shown me that it's not true. It's just one person's kind of experience and perspective. And so, and it's kind of helped me find collaborators in the field who also share that, I think, knowledge, whether that's from their ability to be more self-reflective or from on the ground experiences, and kind of pick out models that institutions or individuals are building that are bi-directional and I think more
based
to reality.
True. Thank you. Yeah.
Janet, do you want to speak to that?
I was just thinking that I'm now, not teaching full-time, but I am still directing a course in the summer for teachers at West Virginia University, and it's one of 5 around the country that's working on bringing the world music pedagogy concept to teachers' work. And that also includes bringing guest artists who are tradition bearers or culture bearers from other parts of the world, specifically though, people who live near us. But it's been a wonderful way to continue to collaborate with bringing artists into the university. It's also a way to send teachers and young teachers out into the community to continue to work in practice. In terms of the research, I'm not really doing that much with that right now. I was certainly incorporating everything I was learning in the qualitative research classes that I've taught, and a world music pedagogy course that I taught. But right now, my work is more sort of hands-on with teachers in the community and teachers in schools, and participating in the education section of the Society for Ethnomusicology, continue to promote those values, I guess.
Thank you.
So for me, the work is, I work partly as an instructor at the university, but also in marketing and music and dance event production. And so, you know, my academic research is really about dances of resistance and how these dances help practitioners develop strategies of resistance in various ways that really try to break down in terms of very specific techniques that they use, embodied techniques. But I think my overall kind of goal with this kind of research, whether it's in Brazil or in the Caribbean or West Africa, wherever I go, it's really about finding new ways to communicate the value of culturally specific forms. Because I see so much of this hierarchization of, you know, classical ballet over every other kind of dance, of classical music over every other kind of dance. And coming myself from a form that is culturally specific, that's seen as a folk form, Irish dancing, that's kind of where I started formulating these ideas, but now traveling the world, just collecting, and collecting is probably kind of a charged term, right? But trying to understand better how different cultures express that value and how I can communicate that to whether it's students, audiences, people that I meet at a party, that kind of thing.
Thank you. That was interesting to know. Thank you so much.
I guess just real quickly, a term that I really like that the professor that I was working with in Ecuador in the center used is like academic infrastructure and building academic infrastructure. And so thinking about how it's not just like a cultural exchange and I'll leave and they'll have like a nice memory of like the naive little gringa that came and I don't know, was interested in nutrition, but like how to create like sustainable infrastructure moving forward. And so I'm really excited because like Alana was saying, I want to go to graduate school, I want to do a PhD, and I'm excited to, through that, build like a deeper research partnership. Also having it go both ways, like talking to my undergraduate institution while I was in Ecuador about like this amazing center, and we're trying to plan some ways that there can be other sort of programs between my undergrad institution and what the center is doing and things like that. And so, yeah, I don't know, trying to build infrastructure. I just like the way they word that.
Thank you.
Great. Alana, do you have anything to say on that point?
I guess not. I have thought a bit about, what I'll bring back, but I think the biggest thing to me will be like the education methods that I've learned, and like how to connect with different people. So I do hopefully like want to go into some sort of environmental education. So just thinking about how different cultural perspectives and affect like the way the education system works will be really interesting and something that I'll be thinking about a lot when I return home. Yeah.
Thanks. That's a great question. I think that's kind of key to what we all do. We are over time. I see that Gordon has his hand up. his interactive digital hand up. So Gordon, if you want to ask a question really quickly, if you all need to go, please feel free to exit. And I will be recording this meeting. I am recording this meeting, so I'll post a link and I'll send it around to everybody afterwards so that you can revisit, that kind of thing, if you missed the end of it, if you missed the beginning. I'll also be sending a link to a survey because we really want to hear your feedback on what you thought about the workshop, if any ideas came up, so that we can continue to develop more workshops like this that would dig more into these more specific ideas. And I love the idea of that Delicia brought in of bringing in the people that we've been working with. I think that would be great. So if you need to go ahead. Gordon, take it away.
Okay. Now, this is just so different from anything that I think of or anything that I do. Briefly, I ask people, what is it you want to do with your music? You know, they all want somebody to hear it or see them dance or whatever it is the hell they do. And I said, then let's work this as a partnership. This isn't going to work if it's mine. It's not going to work if it's yours. It has to be ours. And then I tell them, you are an expert in your country, your group, whatever it is. You know more about this than I ever will. And I'm not even going to pretend to know that I know about it. And then but I, on the other hand, know more than you do about how to promote it internationally and how to make things happen. And let's work together. And it won't be your project and it won't be my project. It'll be ours. And that's what I do. These conversations, to me, again, I haven't been an academic since 1992, and it's just so remote from anything that I think about or that I do or that I want to do. It's interesting, don't get me wrong. But anyway, so I'll mute up, and thanks for listening and all that.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that perspective because I think that we don't want to be in a place where we're all Fulbrighters going to our academic, ivory towers and speaking to ourselves. I think, it's really important that we are also speaking with the communities that we are going out and quote unquote studying. So I really appreciate that perspective and that reminder about why we're doing this work. So we're going to leave it at that. We're out of time, we're past time, but again, I'll be sending around the link and a survey, and I have all of your email addresses now, so we'll let you know when we do more workshops like this, and feel free to email me if you have any feedback that you want to share personally or any thoughts. So
thanks to Kate and Zoe for getting this off the ground.
Yeah, thank
you so much
for participating.
Thank you.
This is awesome.
This has been great.
Thank you.
All right,
Fun.
take it easy, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.